Well, now to a story that the mainstream media continues to lie about. That's Syria and the now debunked chemical weapons attack in the city of Douma in April of 2018. A BS chemical weapons attack that the United States continues to use as propaganda from the White House podium to destroy Syria, to overthrow the Assad government. And today is a landmark day. The Berlin Group 21 has released their new 2-year-long review of the OPCW's investigation. And joining me now is Dr. Piers Robinson, co-director for the Organization for Propaganda Studies. He's been highlighting the problems with the OPCW's investigation for years and helping to debunk this alleged chemical weapons attack, and worked closely with the Berlin Group 21. Dr. Robinson, great to have you back on the show. Is it wrong for me to say today is a big day, a sort of a summation of 2 years of research?
Well, I think it's a very important day in the sense that the Berlin Group 21 review pulls together in a very comprehensive manner all of the material which has emerged over the since 2019, emerged in the context of investigators involved with the Duma investigation, blowing the whistle effectively, which has emerged through many, many documents which have come into the public domain, and which has been reported on at various points by, for example, Peter Hitchens in the UK and Aaron Maté, of course, from the Grey Zone. And this report pulls all of this together in a very comprehensive way, and also sets it in the context of the recent IIT report from the OPCW, the investigations team, which produced their attribution of a responsibility judgment regarding the Duma attack, and of course blamed the Syrian government. And we were able, with the Berlin 21 review, to essentially look at that report very carefully. And it did, and as I think I talked about in our previous interview, it essentially embedded the manipulations which you can see in the original Duma report. So we now have a very high level of deception, I would argue, going on in terms of what the OPCW is putting out into the public domain over Duma. And our review pulls this together and demonstrates where the manipulations occurred. Essentially summarizes, of course, it's a very long report, but it pulls together and summarizes the key issues which are now outstanding regarding the specific Duma investigation, and also puts it, I think, in the wider context of what's been going on since 2013, 2012 in Syria with the entire chemical weapons issue.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that you've uncovered and that are presented in this report, some of the key pieces of deception. Can you give us some of the key pieces of deception here that have been put forward by the OPCW and then parroted at the White House? You know, and I think that even recently heard Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, once again regurgitating some of these lies in front of the White House press corps. Can you talk about some of this deception?
Well, how I would put this is to run through what I think are four of the clearest and easiest to understand what I would describe as deceptions which have occurred, and which, to all intents and purposes, remain buried from the official narrative point of view. And the first one is a kind of procedural issue. This is how it's referred to in the Berlin Review. But it's the fact that the original interim report, which was drafted by a Brendan Whelan, that report was drafted, finalized, and was going to go to publication from the OPCW. And at the last minute, it was substituted with another report without the knowledge of the inspectors, a report which essentially was spun and suggested there was evidence the attack had occurred. And this is, when you stop and think about it for a second, this is a pretty blatant act of deception. You have a team working on a report, it's agreed, and it's going to go to publication, and it gets switched at the last minute. And it only comes to light because the person responsible for drafting the report, Brendan Whelan, picks up that this has occurred and then issues the initial protest, the grave concern email, which went to the chief of cabinet in the OPCW, saying that this is totally unacceptable. And this deception has never been addressed by the OPCW nor any of its supporters, the fact that this report was switched in that way. So that's a very major issue, and that really goes back to the very start of this in terms of the emergence of controversy within the OPCW. I think the second broad sort of procedural issue is the fact that, as we document in the Berlin Review, no one disputes the fact that two very senior OPCW inspectors raised fundamental issues and blew the whistle to all intents and purposes over what had happened with the Duma investigation. And all that has happened over the years is that they have been sidelined, smeared. Anyone supporting them has been subjected to smears and attacked, discounted as disinformation, etc. And so when you have a situation where two very experienced, very senior people within an organization raise these concerns, it's to any outsider, it's obvious that the organization should take seriously what they have said and essentially respond to the calls for, right, we need to get everybody on the team sat down and go through this information and the evidence again. And it's never happened. The story, for those of your viewers who are familiar with it, will know that they've simply been shut down and smeared for years now. So that's a pretty major issue and deception, I think, in this case.
I think one thing I just want to let you continue on the pieces or the omissions from this report, the OPCW report, the deceptions here. But I think it's an important point. This is something that Aaron Mate speaks about regularly, which is the initial OPCW investigation did a great job, actually, did it not? And then it was the subsequent whitewashing of it and the diminishment of it that became the problem. The initial people that actually worked on it, some of the initial investigators, did a great job. Did they not?
Yeah, I think how you describe it and how Aaron describes it is accurate. The team who put together and the drafting of the original interim report was objective and accurate.
And what did it find?
What it found was that essentially there are a series of significant inconsistencies, in the evidence. There were question marks, which we'll come to in a minute. And the report accurately relayed these inconsistencies. And then at the end of the report said, look, there are two possibilities here. One is the attack as alleged, or the possibility that something else has occurred here. So saying that there are two possible, which we do not know the answer to yet, and we need to do more research in order to establish that. And that was a pretty accurate reflection of the facts as they had them. How the report was doctored and spun was to suggest essentially the attack had occurred, and all of the issues and inconsistencies in the evidence were effectively, very dramatically whitewashed out of the redacted interim report. So yes, the team had done a good job, but their intervention at a critical stage and, as it were, manipulated and spun in order to reach the conclusion that obviously the French, British and American governments were eager to see out in the public domain, especially given the fact that they had attacked Syria 1 week after the events in Duma in retaliation. So a lot of incentive on their part for to ensure that the OPCW came out with the right result and so on.
Right.
But they had done a good job, yes, and it was...
Yeah. Using this as cover to carry out attacks and try to destabilize this government. It is worth noting, we've had Kevork Almasian on the show a number of times, a friend of the show, great journalist from Syria, who points out that in 2011, Syria was listed as one of the safest countries in the entire world. One in the entire world. It was until Western meddling involved itself in destabilizing this country. So just so people have a broader understanding of how safe and beautiful this country is and was, it's just incredibly disheartening to see what the West has done here. And it's incumbent upon us to really get this story out. I'll get you out of here on this, Doctor, which is, can you continue just explaining some of the deceit or the convenient omissions that the Berlin 21 group found as it relates to this OPCW report?
Well, two of the obvious or easy to understand issues which are persisting, even with the latest IIT report. One is that the question mark over the cylinders and the damage you see on the cylinders and the damage you see on the roofs in the two buildings, that they're not compatible. And the OPCW has been unable to present any evidence which shows that they are compatible. But they're fudged that, and they continue to fudge it, probably because they can't show it, because the damage on the cylinders is not compatible with the ceiling. So that's something which you can see persisting through, and it's obvious from the visual imagery you can see in the review, for example, that the damage is not compatible. The second major issue is the suppression of the original toxicology report, which concluded with input from expert toxicologists that the deceased in Duma were not killed by chlorine gas, as was alleged, that something else had happened. And they continue to fudge on that issue as well, quite obviously in the IIT report, where they don't resolve any of the problems that those toxicologists originally raised. In fact, their account is essentially censored or buried come the IIT report. So you've got an alleged incident where cylinders aren't compatible with the damage on the roofs, and you have the 43 dead people who were not killed by chlorine gas, and so on. And these are the major, I think, sort of scientific issues which need to get engaged with, because obviously they point to something else having happened in this case.
You have a long history, of course. You're co-director for the Organization for Propaganda Studies. And I said I was going to get you out of here on the last question, but I'll get you out of here on this. Perhaps maybe no one knows more about propaganda in the world maybe than you, and can help us understand this. So I think it's important, right? This incident happens. The West creates this sort of cover story, uses it as cover to go in and basically attack and destroy Syria, and cover up the actual toxicology, cover up actually what happened, perhaps placed these cylinders there to look like a chemical attack. It's now been widely debunked. But the lie has already spread around the world, and that's really how propaganda flourishes, does it not? Can you explain how now this lie is out there? The White House openly talks about it, that Assad gasses his own people, and it's very hard then to put the facts, or this sort of propaganda genie back in the bottle, I guess. Can you explain that process and why propaganda then is so effective?
Well, this process works because when you look at Syria as a whole, as you mentioned, Kevork's work and so on, and the whole conflict in Syria has been accompanied by a major propaganda operation with significant resources being put into maintaining a narrative, maintaining a particular truth. And one of those truths or narratives which has been pushed, and I think the evidence is clear, and my work continues on this, even in Ghouta 2013, you have a propaganda deception narrative built around allegations of chemical weapons used by the Syrian government. And these aren't true. But this is a narrative which huge resources have been placed into maintaining. And one of the reasons it's effective is because they do put a huge amount of money and personnel and organization. And you can see it very clearly with the Duma issue. You can see that when finally cracks appear and even people within the organization start to speak out saying, look, we're being dragged along into the contrails of a Western propaganda operation, you see the scale of reaction against those people, the attacks against me, like myself and other colleagues and so on who've raised questions about this. It's all part of the propaganda, and it's effective because they've got a lot of firepower. And as you say, international organizations, and this is why it's such a big issue at the OPCW, these organizations becoming caught up in this kind of propaganda. People believe these organizations. They think that they're independent and reliable, when in this case, for sure, they have become part of essentially Western foreign policy. And that, as you say, is effective. In the alternative legacy media, people are much better informed, and there's much more space, and people have seen a lot of the evidence, etc. But the legacy corporate media play along, and that makes the propaganda effective from the point of view of governments. So, I mean, in a way, that's I think the issue there. People, in a sense, think of Syria, and they're possibly not aware of the scale of the conflict in terms of Western involvement, Operation Timber Sycamore and so on, and the scale of the energy and effort put into maintaining the narrative. But as with all narratives in wartime, they're vulnerable to the truth. And I think with Duma, and as with many other aspects of the conflict in Syria, as time goes on, and as we're seeing it happening in Ukraine, the truth does slowly come out. It's a painful, difficult process, and people suffer in the process, as have the inspectors who have effectively blown the whistle in the case of Duma, and many other people who've raised questions. It is a painful process, but the truth does come out. And I think, certainly with our review, anyone taking an objective look at it will see very clearly that things have gone very badly wrong with the OPCW's investigation of Duma. Well,
yeah, this narrative is starting to crumble, and with help, in no small part to the work that you have done. So thank you for the incredible work that you've done, and the Berlin 21 group as well. We're going to have that report linked up in our show description. I encourage our audience to go and read it and share it all over social media and get this message out about this. I had a friend, a former FBI agent, tell me that when they wanted to get propaganda out into the media, they would go to the legacy media, they would go to the New York Times to leak these stories, they would go to the Washington Post to leak these stories. Those were the first steps in trying to get out propaganda. So when you read legacy media reports about this stuff, always remember where this stuff comes from. Very, very important. So thank you for sharing it here with independent media on Redacted. And we are doing our best to get this story out for you and to make sure that the world is aware of this. Dr. Piers Robinson, thank you for your amazing work, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Clayton.
And if you just think about, thanks to the doctor, the Obama administration pushing this narrative and then launching deadly airstrikes that killed thousands of civilians.
Yes, and continue to do so.
And continue to do so. If you're not bothered by this, then your head is not screwed on right.
Yeah.
The United States of America gets up at the freaking podium inside the White House press briefing and tells you this lie about what happened there, and then uses it as cover to go in and destabilize and take over a country and kill civilians. I mean, we should all be outraged about this.
And waste an economy, which we did a story a couple months ago, which by some university estimates has killed between 3 and 4 million children and left them wasting and starving like a banana that's too long in the fruit tray. And we allow it. And we just sort of sit there like, yes, sanctions on Syria, that's appropriate, even still.
Yeah.
So, yes, these things have a reverberation that are continuing to have a deleterious effect on families.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, this type of story, it might not have the bells and whistles and the flashiness of other news stories that you might see on CNN in a 3-minute segment, and to get into the nuance of a report from Dr. Piers Robinson is incredibly important. And no one is going to cover this story, just a few independent journalists. And it's so important that we get out the propaganda that is used to lead us into these proxy wars, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Syria. You're watching it unfold right now in Niger, by the way. You're going to see it from the White House podium today, tomorrow, over the next few days about the terrorists in Niger and how we need to send weapons and troops into Niger to take over. Again, the lies and the propaganda.
Well, And which coups are good coups and which coups are bad coups. This is not like the Maidan coup.
Yeah.
This is a bad coup.
This is a different one.
Right?
Yeah.
Different thing altogether. Is it maybe because the color of their skin or because financial interests? This is a story that, happening right before our very eyes.
Yeah, and we
decide how we feel about it based on where's our personal interest.
We've been covering the Syria story for years on this show. This is not new, but this major event today, this review coming out today is new, and it could open the doors for a massive investigation, which we're very excited about. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's one of the most frustrating things for me is having conversations with people is most people aren't willing to go back in order to move forward. It's they want to know, what's the news that's happening right now? I don't care about all this that's happened, but we can never go forward the right way unless we go back and know what actually happened so that we can see the things that they're doing now that are the same as back then.
Yeah, context. It's important. Well, that's the beauty of learning your history, because you are doomed to repeat it if you don't understand it. And so it is incumbent upon reporters who are in the White House press briefing room when Karine Jean-Pierre gets up there and starts spinning lies about Niger or other countries. These reporters can say, wait a second, the White House the Obama administration, which your president right now is a part of as vice president, lied to us about what happened in Syria. We now have the news. We now have the data on this. Are you lying to us right now? In which she'll scoff and say, I can't believe you'd ask that question.
Right.
I can't believe you'd be so callous as to ask a real question in a press briefing room. Anyway.
I was reading an Oscar Wilde poetry book this weekend for a summer reading competition that I just have to win. And this quote stuck with me. The fact is that people have an insatiable curiosity to know everything except what is worth knowing. So, we're super interested about Kim Kardashian and all of that stuff, but like what we actually have to study, uninterested in. Not us, of course. I mean, look at our chat. Look at our comments. We have really engaged and educated audience, and we really appreciate where you guys point us in what direction. This is a community where we share information. I am not interested in what Kim Kardashian eats for breakfast. No. I am interested in rewinding the tape on these war propaganda lies that lead to other people's deaths.
Well, we've got more news to get to here on your Monday. We've been busy, and we brought you some really interesting stories, particularly on the FDA fast-tracking this new postpartum depression drug, which unbelievable how the FDA is in bed with big pharmaceutical companies. In fact, today in Europe, I had a conversation with a doctor that said, I don't know what the United States is doing, but the cozy relationship between big pharma and government regulators is unbelievable. And she was explaining just the difference, between the United States and different countries and the collusion between big pharma. Anyway, we'll get to that story. Plus, Patrick Lancaster on the front lines with these kamikaze drone attacks that Russia has now just unleashed on the front lines of Ukrainian troops. We'll get there in mere moments. Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.